I'm going to start off talking a little bit about my own research, because this is kind of my area, I guess. That's why I've been asked to give this lecture, so I'll talk a little bit about what I've done in this area so you get an idea of where I'm coming from. Then I'll talk a bit about what discourse analysis is and why people have argued that it's a good idea to use corpus methods to use discourse analysis. And then I'll kind of discuss some of the types of research questions that we can ask when we use this approach. Then I'll go on to talk about some of the different ways that we can maybe start to use carrot analysis. So I'll talk about this distinction between corpus-driven and corpus-based approaches. And I'll talk about an analytical model, which we can refer to as well, which I tend to use. And then I'll go on to actually give some examples of analysis, some illustrative examples, based upon looking at collocates, first of all, and concordances, and then an example looking at keywords as well. So these are examples from my own research. Then I'll go on to talk about how we can maybe incorporate some techniques from critical discourse analysis in order to do corpus linguistics-based discourse analysis. And the example that I'm going to give there is based upon intertextuality. So a lot to get through in that first hour. So, right from the beginning, I'll start off by saying something about my own research. Over the past decade or so, I've used corpora to analyse discourses. And this is a fairly new thing. When I started doing this, there wasn't really many of us doing it. There was only about 2 or 3 of us. So it kind of felt as if I was kind of walking into a dark room and having to kind of feel my way around. And I got things wrong a lot and made a lot of mistakes. So what I'm trying to do over the next 4 hours that I've got with you is to sort of stop you from making the mistakes I made over the last 10 years in some ways, so you get a head start on me. There's kind of been various strands of my research. As well as analysing discourses in corpora, I've tried to develop new methods, because there weren't really very many methods in order to do this when I started doing it. So there's a kind of methodological strand as well. And in the last few years, I've kind of become more critical and reflective, thinking about the methods that I use, how good actually are they? Do they actually do what I'm claiming they do, that sort of thing. So that's been a kind of third strand of my research more recently. And I've used quite a wide range of corpora in my analyses, ranging from written data, things like newspapers and health leaflets, spoken data. I've looked at television sitcoms, I've looked at government debates, looked at all different types of things there. I've also tended to kind of look at various identity groups and how they're represented. I tend to kind of pick on groups where people tend to say quite unpleasant things about and sort of point out, that this is a problem and the sort of ways in which they're talked about unpleasantly. So I've looked at groups relating to gender and sexuality, things like gay men, bachelors and spinsters, feminists, things like that. There's also been another strand of my research which has looked at religion and ethnicity. So I've looked at Muslims in the press and immigration and the way that the press writes about foreign doctors. And the recent thing I'm working on at the moment is looking at how people on benefits are written about within public discourse. There's been a quite big change in the way that, just yesterday I think, in the way that people receive benefits. So I've been trying to look at why that's happened and how public discourse has kind of helped that along. And over the course of this lecture today, I'll be sort of drawing on some examples from these sort of identity groups as well. So, what do I mean by the term discourse? It's a horrible, tricky, unpleasant term, which tends to take about 6 pages of anyone's PhD thesis in their first chapter or second chapter to explain, because it's got so many different meanings. I don't want to go through all of them. I think it would take far too long. It's a lecture in itself. I've just included 3 commonly used definitions there, which are kind of all interlinked to each other as well, which kind of explains why it's such a slippery, horrible term. The first definition gives discourse as any form of language which exists above the sentence or above the clause. So this, you could say discourse is a paragraph of text, or it's a self-contained text, such as an advert or a short story or a song. Oops. And sometimes this meaning of discourse gets extended into the second meaning, so we refer to a text type or a genre of language as being a certain discourse. So we can talk about, say, political discourse or environmental discourse or something like that. So political discourse would refer to anything which occurs within political contexts, debates in parliament, political literature like election pamphlets, things like that. And sometimes this meaning of discourse can have a sort of attitudinal or kind of stance kind of connection associated with it. So we can maybe talk about environmental discourse, but what we actually mean here is when people kind of viewing the sort of language associated with caring for the environment as a good thing. So we might look at something like Greenpeace and say that's environmental discourse. But we're talking about environmental discourse from a stance of thinking that we need to care about the environment rather than in a very neutral way. And that takes us to our third meaning of discourse here, which is the one which I kind of tend to find most useful and quote the most, which is involving ways of representing the world. So here Burr, drawing on people like Foucault, says that discourse is a set of meanings, metaphors, representations, images, stories, statements and so on, that in some way together produce a particular version of events. Surrounding any one object or event or person, there may be a variety of different discourses, each with a different story to tell about the world, a different way of representing it to the world. And people can kind of hold these kind of quite conflicting discourses in their heads at the same time. And when you analyse their language, they can be drawing on different ones at different points. And sometimes they're not even aware that they're contradicting themselves. And some people have tried to spot discourses within text, looking at the text themselves and saying, well, where is the discourse in this text and how do I know what it is? And also some people try to give them names. And we can kind of draw on the idea of interdiscursivity here, the idea that there are these different discourses and there are relationships between them. Some may be competing with each other, some may be reinforcing, some may be kind of higher order discourses, and some may be quite small, very specific discourses, which kind of are sub-discourses of other ones. To give an example, I've got some here which are relating to gender. And most of you probably will be familiar with these kind of ways of thinking about gender, even if they haven't been spelled out in this way, even if they haven't been named like this. So you may be aware, or I've encountered something which people have labelled as the gender differences discourse, an idea that men and women are just different from each other. Men are like this, women are like that. They have these different qualities. And sometimes people say what the qualities are, sometimes they don't. Another one would be male superiority, this idea, wrong, I think, that men are stronger, more intelligent, etc. than women, that sort of discourse. Another one, maybe coming from a more feminist perspective, would be the idea of male dominance, the idea that men dominate women. And then finally, we've got one of equality, gender equality, the idea that men and women are actually equal. So you can see of those four how they may contradict each other, some may reinforce each other, some may be more specific, some may be more general. So how are they articulated in language? How do we actually get to them and identify them? Because we do encounter them through language a lot, but we don't encounter them in a direct way. People don't say, I'm referring to the gender differences discourse here. We never ever come across that, except in cases like I've just said. Instead, people usually refer to these discourses, they draw on them using a much more kind of unconscious language. They're not really aware that they're doing this, and they're often more indirect and about it, more subtle, and they may use things like implicatures and things like that. So they may use quite generalizing statements, for example, about men and women as a way of drawing on one of these discourses. And I've got a very short example here. This is from the British National Corpus, which we'll be using in the second hour today. And this is a conversation. It's from the spoken text. And it's from somebody called David and somebody called Patricia. I don't know who they are, but I'm assuming they're a male and a female. David is talking about John Major, which dates the data in the corpus quite well. John Major was Prime Minister in the early 90s in the UK. And he says, what would John Major have said? Patricia says, who's John Major? And David says, the Prime Minister, you dope. And then there's a pause of 8 seconds, and then he says, typical woman. Now that's the discourse bit coming out, those last two words. He's making a generalizing statement. He's saying that what Patricia has just said or done is typical of what women are like. So I think he's drawing on that male superiority discourse, this idea that men are more intelligent than the women don't know who the Prime Minister of the country is, that sort of thing. And one popular form of analysis which concentrates on discourse, something you probably may be aware of already, is something called CDA, or critical discourse analysis. I don't want to spend too long on this, but it's useful to know a bit about what it traditionally involves before we go on to look at other approaches, because it does tend to feed in quite a bit to the research that I do. CDA sees language as social practice, and it's interested in how ideologies and power relationships are expressed through language and in texts. So a CDA analysis is quite complex. It works at lots of different levels, which makes it quite difficult and complicated to sometimes do. A CDA analysis would look at the words on a page. It would look at a text itself. But that's only the start of the analysis, really. It also considers things like other texts that refer to that text, so intertextuality, and interdiscursivity, so how the different discourses relate to each other within a text. It also considers issues of production and reception. So it thinks about the text, and it thinks about who produced that text. You know, why did they produce it? What reasons for? And what restrictions were there on that text? So was there censorship in that society that the text was created within? Things like that. What were they allowed to say and what were they allowed not to say? And then it looks at reception. So it looks at, you know, how did that text get distributed within the society? Who read it? You know, who was it aimed for? Who actually did read it? And what did they think of it? So then did they complain about it? Did it cause a riot? That sort of thing. So there's this whole kind of idea of context around the text itself. And as well as the specific context of the text, they then look at the whole society. So they think, well, okay, we've got a text, it's produced in a society, what's actually going on in that society? You know, what's the political situation? What's happening in terms of history which led up to the events of that text being created at that point in time? So there's a whole kind of set of things that people who do CDA have to take into account. And I kind of feel sorry for them often because there's so much, and I sometimes feel they don't always do it very well because there's too much to actually do properly. And one potential criticism of people who do CDA is that because of all this stuff they've got to do, they can't do a lot. So they sometimes pick on one text or 6 texts or something like that, and they do a really detailed, in-depth, qualitative analysis of all of the words in that text. But the problem with that is that how do we know that the texts they've picked are not the result of their own biases? So, for example, they think, I don't know, the press write about Muslims in a very negative way. They pick 6 texts that prove that. But someone could say, well, okay, yeah, you've proved it. Those 6 texts are really Islamophobic. But what about those 6,000 texts, which actually, they're quite nice about Muslims? This is just a hypothetical example. So they sometimes get accused of cherry-picking data in order to prove a kind of preconceived point. Because people who do CDA often they're very driven in terms of what they want to analyse. They have kind of quite political commitments to things, and that's what drives their analysis. They're not really starting off from a kind of very neutral or trying to be sort of objective position, I'd say. So, why would we use a corpus approach in order to kind of counter this criticism? Well, if we collect a corpus of maybe hundreds or thousands of texts, then we've got better evidence that any linguistic patterns that we find are going to be representative of an overall picture. We can't be accused of cherry-picking in that case. Also, the procedures that we use with corpus linguistics are not biased. A computer isn't biased when it does an analysis. You know, it doesn't pick out certain things because it thinks they're interesting or they confirm its own suspicions. So they kind of direct us to things that we maybe wouldn't have thought of ourselves. And that's really good because it stops us from being biased. I think we can't remove bias altogether, and that's something I'll be talking about in a couple of days' time. But at least it's kind of the beginning of removing a sort of a level of bias from our analysis, which can be quite problematic. And finally, I think if we've got a very large corpus, we're more likely to see the whole picture. We're likely to see the majority stuff in there, so the main patterns, but we're also likely maybe to see these kind of minority discourses, the kind of alternative positions that maybe don't get said or stated very often. Maybe they only occur, you know, once in 1,000 times. And if you pick just 6 texts, you're probably going to miss them. But if you have 1,000,000 texts, you're going to get a few examples of them, and hopefully, if you're good enough at doing the analysis, you'll be able to get them out. So the corporate gives us the opportunity to see the minority patterns as well as the majority ones. Okay, what sort of research questions is this sort of approach best suited to answer? For me, the sort of kind of a question that I tend to sort of start off with asking is something like this first one. How is a particular group or an identity or a concept represented in this data, in this corpus data? What discourses are surrounding that particular group? But corpus analysis is very good at comparing different things together. So we might want to incorporate a second type of question here, which is, are there differences or similarities or influences between maybe 2 groups, where 2 groups are represented, or maybe between how one group is represented within 2 different types of data. So, for example, we may want to pick on two related groups, say men and women, and look at how they're represented in the same corpus. Are there differences or are there similarities? Or we may want to look at, say, just women, but look at, say, Chinese newspaper data and British newspaper data. So we've got one group, but 2 different types of data there. Another way of thinking about discourse is not only what are the discourses within a corpus, but how do they actually get legitimated in there? How, you know, because sometimes when people are writing about discourses, they have to kind of back them up with arguments in order to kind of justify why they're there and why they're saying them. So we might want to look at language around legitimation. What strategies and techniques do people use in order to legitimate sort of giving certain discourses within a text? Particularly if you're looking at discourses surrounding a particular group of people who are maybe a minority group and the discourses are very negative around them, then often you find a lot of legitimation strategy going on in order to justify why they're being so unpleasant about a particular group of people. And the final research question, one that we usually get to last, is who benefits from all of this? This is a very CDA type of question. So if a particular group or concept is constructed in a certain way, is that good or bad for that group? Is it good or bad for somebody else? Who's going to benefit from that particular construction? And again, this is where, with CDA, we have to draw on all of these social context issues in order to really fully answer that question properly. Now, there are lots of ways that we can do analysis of discourse, but I want to make a distinction between two different types of corpus approaches which are sort of related to each other. I don't know if this is something you got talked about yesterday. There's something called the corpus-driven approach, and this involves you start off viewing your corpus from a naive perspective. I think it's impossible to be completely naive about anything when you do analysis, but we kind of have that idea in our mind that we're going to be naive. We have no hypotheses. We have our data. We try not to kind of impose our own views on it or ideas or hypotheses, and we just go into the corpus and we get things like frequency lists or we get keywords, and they drive our analysis along. So the corpus drives the data. We don't drive the data ourselves. We don't know what we're going to find out is interesting in advance. And often this can lead to more interesting questions later on now. The second approach is called corpus-based approach. So this is maybe where we're more coming from a traditional CDA perspective. We kind of have an idea that there's something maybe wrong with this data, or this group of people have been represented in a certain way. So we have our hypotheses, and then we say, I'm going to use a corpus, I'm going to investigate these hypotheses. So we know what we're going to search on. We search on certain terms, we look for things in the data that we expect to find. And we may find them, we may not. But that's the way that we do the data analysis. Of course, there's no reason why you can't combine a combination, and I think really what I would argue is that the best kind of analysis actually draws on both of these approaches and kind of goes from one to the other, and towards the end I'll show you how I've done that. And some people have argued anyway that this distinction is a bit of a kind of false distinction. It's kind of one of those kind of fake binary setups, more kind of idealistic, because it's really, really difficult, I think, to carry out a corpus analysis from a very naive approach. We always have ideas about what a certain group have been represented in because we live in society and we're aware of how they've been talked about in advance. So the analysis that I do usually have various stages to them. I've got 4 stages there. Sometimes you can kind of move back and forth between these stages, and I've kind of taken these from kind of traditional CDA methods as well. So this is what people in CDA tend to do as well as me. Stage 1 is very descriptive. We look at the corpus, we identify the patterns in the corpus, what's frequent, what's not frequent, what are the keywords, what are the collocates, those sorts of things, what are the differences between 2 texts maybe, and we just describe it. Stage 2, we have to interpret these patterns. So we ask, how do these patterns contribute towards the realizations of different types of discourses? And we might want to group certain patterns together and think about the effects that these patterns might have on readers if they read them. Thirdly, we have explanation. So we have to explain the pattern. And this sometimes is where we have to step outside the corpus altogether. We kind of put it aside for a moment, we look outside it, and we think about various contexts that are relevant. So we may want to consider maybe the legal status of the group that we're examining, look at maybe opinion poll data about that group, maybe laws to do with what is allowed to be written in society or what gets censored, things like that. And then finally, we have this evaluation stage where we ask who benefits or not from these representations or discourses that we found. And this could even involve making recommendations. You know, we could say that this text has this use of language, these discourses, this is a problem, these are recommendations for change. And this might sound very kind of artificial and abstract and people don't listen, but I think people are starting to listen to this sort of analysis. For example, I was at Parliament yesterday giving a kind of talk on homophobia in the Daily Mail to groups of MPs. So I think that people are starting to engage with this kind of analysis. And I think it is important that when we do it, we make sure that we don't just do it and then don't tell anybody. I think it's a kind of a duty for us to kind of put it out there and get people to actually engage with it. So we're not just talking in a closed room anymore. But some people don't want to do that last bit, and I think that kind of maybe is optional. So I'd say if you don't really want to kind of do that evaluation and you want to stay maybe a bit more neutral, that's okay as well. I'm not forcing you to do that at all.